So today I'm going to talk about the application of ecological theory to biofilter design. And this talk is basically, it's based on a paper that I published with Andrew Mering in 2015 in Wire's Water. People want to go find more information. I'm going to run fairly quickly through the introductory material because I think most of you are familiar with it, but I consider biofilters to be essentially human-built ecosystems that consist of really 5 major components. Most important, perhaps, are the soils or filter media, and these are often planted with plants. And in the soils, we find microbes and animals, and then water is the other key component. Now, biofilters, also called rain gardens, sometimes bioswales, they have other names, are becoming increasingly common. We know from a quick survey done in Los Angeles County that there are at least 185 of them. There are probably many more. Some of them are shown on these slides. I'm sorry, you need to go to the next figure with the map, and then go to slide, let me look at the slide numbers here. Now go to slide 4. Biofilter functions that could benefit from the application of ecological theory are many. The water purification or quality functions I've listed here that we might be interested in improving include water retention, infiltration, and we should add harvest to that list, nutrient removal and transformation, the removal of metals, pathogens, organic contaminants, and the deposition of suspended particles. But beyond the water purification functions, there are other services we might care about that biofilters can provide: carbon sequestration, habitat provision, pollination, aesthetics, and Jennifer Lay's going to talk more about those. Next slide, please, number 5. Now, many biofilters are often planted with a number of standard plant types. We have rushes, sedges, grasses, reeds, and shrubs most commonly found. Next slide, number 6, shows the plant traits that these plants have that might affect their function within biofilters. So we might care about aspects of above ground architecture. For example, leaf area and morphology or shoot height all would affect the movement of water, whether it's slowed, enhanced retention, the deposition of particles, shading, and evapotranspiration. There are many root properties that affect the ability to take up nutrients or reduce clogging, whether the plant is a dicot or monocot, how much litter it produces. All of these will affect function. And I'm going fairly quickly through these because I want to have time to get to the ecological theories. So within the soils, next slide, number 7, we know we have many different types of invertebrates. And some examples from Southern California biofilters are shown here. And if you go to the next slide, I've listed the traits of these invertebrates that might influence their function. Burrowing affects the porosity and water infiltration. It affects oxygenation, which affects phosphorus retention, and burrowing affects microbes. And a number of other properties: shredding and grazing by invertebrates, filter feeding by invertebrates, the invertebrate gut microhabitats, all can influence function, and some of the invertebrates have guts that produce greenhouse gases. I think hopefully Andrew will mention that. Next slide, number 9, shows Andrew Mering's wonderful artwork that illustrates the effects of the invertebrates in soils on some of the functions or properties that might affect water purification function. So the breakdown of leaf litter by millipedes, oligochaetes, isopods. Some of the collembolas are often fungivores, and they both can affect mycorrhizae and other fungi. And very importantly, earthworms can burrow, changing infiltration, decreasing clogging. They can enhance plant growth, enhance nutrient uptake or metal uptake, and even enhance denitrification. If we go to slide number 10, I really get to the meat of this talk. I'd like to ask the question, can we apply ecological theory to rain garden or biofilter design? And there are about 7 different theories that I'd like to try to briefly touch on. If you go to slide 11, I've listed the goals of the application of ecological theory. We're interested in modifying biofilter design, the maintenance and adaptive management to improve functional efficiency, often to extend the lifetime of the biofilter, to reduce costs, to provide additional ecosystem services, and in some cases, these ideas lead to development of a research agenda and experimentation. If you go to slide 12, I now begin discussing the different theories, and the first one is very funny because it's called ecosystem engineers. Now, for engineers, this is going to sound odd, but this is a term used by ecologists to talk about plants and animals whose presence or activity alters their physical surrounding or changes the flow of water resources, thereby creating or modifying habitats. So we have many structure-forming biota that can play key roles in modifying many aspects of the environment, in providing food to the animals living there, in providing refuge from predators, and in creating three-dimensional space. So in the ocean, for example, common ecosystem engineers would be coral reefs or kelp forests. But in biofilters, if you go to slide 13, we see that plants are, in fact, probably one of the most important ecosystem engineers. And we are really in the process of trying, I would say, the grand we, scientists are trying to understand how grasses versus sedges versus shrubs versus rushes might affect the function of biofilters. Another very important ecosystem engineer in biofilters are earthworms, also known as oligochaetes, and these have many different physical effects on the soil: aeration, changes in porosity and infiltration. They affect the chemistry of the soil, and they have biological effects and often facilitate other animals. The next major category of theory has to do, and if you go to slide 14, you'll see the relationship between species diversity and ecosystem function. There's a whole literature out there that addresses this from an ecological perspective, and there are many different theories. I'm not going to focus on all of them, but I want to home in on the theories, the belief that more species promotes better ecological function. In other words, that there's a positive relationship. If you go to slide 15, I ask, why might high biodiversity promote better biofilter function? And I want to talk about 4 hypotheses about why there might be a positive relationship between species richness and the function of biofilters. And to liven things up a little bit, I'm going to try to illustrate these theories not only visually with the slides, you can go to slide 16 now, but I'm also going to illustrate them with music. Hopefully you'll be able to hear. So the first of these theories about why there should be a positive relationship between species richness or diversity and biofilter function has to do with the sampling effect. This is the probability of selecting the highest functioning species, the probability that the highest functioning species will be present if you maximize diversity. Now, if you don't actually know which species functions best, this sampling effect kicks in. So in my example, and you're going to have to click through a number of times here, I have the sedge circled in green as being the best functioning species. If we sample only 2 species, click again a couple times, you'll see that we might not, and we didn't know sedge was best, when we put in just a couple of other types, we might not get the best functioning species. Click again a couple of times, if we sample 3 species, again, we might not guess the best functioning species. Click again. You'll see that if we put in all our options, the chances of getting the best functioning species in our system is going to be better, and we've got our sedge circled in green there. So very often the best functioning species is simply one that survives the conditions and stays in place through whatever environmental conditions we have. And I've illustrated this with music. Okay, I can't see anybody, so I don't know if you guys are laughing or frowning or crying, whatever. All right, if you go to the next slide, The second possible reason why species diversity and ecosystem function might be positively correlated has to do with facilitation. We know there are many positive plant-plant interactions, positive plant-animal interactions, and positive plant-microbe interactions. And more species increase the likelihood of having facilitative interactions that could involve shading or nitrogen fixation, aeration, mycorrhizae, and so on. One example we do know that exists is that two species that are common in biofilters in Australia, Carex oppressa and Lomandra longifolia, were shown to remove more nutrients when grown together compared to Lomandra longifolia alone. It's also important to note that some plant species have negative interactions. They might shade each other or have chemical interactions that are bad, and so we would want to avoid putting those two species together. So to illustrate the concept of facilitation, I give you a song. We are family. I got all my sisters with me. We are family. Okay, if we go to the next slide. A third possible hypothesis for why we might find positive species diversity ecosystem function relationships is called complementarity, with the idea that different species perform different functions or different ways of achieving a function best. So this can happen both within functions and across functions. If we go to the next slide, it has a big C, niche complementarity on top. Here's an example within functions. For example, if we're interested in removing nitrogen, we might find that different species take up different forms of nitrogen, or some take it up through the leaves and some take it up through the roots. And some perform denitrification. And if we have all of those species working together, we have the maximum nitrogen removal. And here's the song to illustrate niche complementarity. It's a little bit more quiet. I don't know if you can hear that. We go together. Okay, next slide. Another form of niche complementarity occurs across ecosystem functions where we have different species performing different functions best. And you're probably going to have to click one more time to see the whole slide. We might have some species that are better at metal uptake, others better at nitrogen uptake, others better, more influence on pathogen removal or preventing clogging or slowing flow. And the concept is that when we have all those species working together, we have all the functions performed to maximize the desired biofilter function. The song for that. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to get them loud in some cases. That's the theme song for Greece. Okay, next slide is the insurance effect. So you're going to have to, again, click a couple of times. The concept of the insurance effect, a fourth explanation for why we might maximize why we would have a positive relationship between function and diversity, is that different species function better in different years or under different environmental conditions. So some species, for example, grass and shrubs, might be better in normal years. Click again. Rushes and reed might do better in wet years. Click again. Perhaps the sedge does best in dry years. So having multiple species might ensure that some species survive and function under a broad range of conditions. Again, music for the insurance hypothesis, and these are my favorite, by Bob Dylan. Okay, and one more. And the best.
And there's no telling who that it's naming. Was the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing.
Okay, next slide. Number 3, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is another theory that could be relevant. This suggests that diversity is actually highest under intermediate disturbance conditions. And if we have an interest in maximizing diversity, because it might maximize function for the reasons I've just been talking about, we might want to expect to find the highest diversity in biofilters that experience intermediate disturbance. Knowing how and when this happens, I think we aren't there yet, but it might involve mid-sized biofilters, middle-aged biofilters, places with intermediate storm frequency. This is just a way to think about the relationship between disturbance and diversity. Next slide, number 4. The theory of succession, an important ecological theory, suggests that communities change in a focused way over time. And I think, you know, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this quickly, but just ask the question, might we think about biofilters performing different services at different ages or stages of their development? Young biofilters, for example, might be really good at contaminant removal. Older ones might have better infiltration. Really old ones might be more important in providing habitat and ecosystem, and maybe less in terms of water purification. So this is something to think about. The next set of concepts really involve the fact that biofilters occur, next slide, biofilters occur in an urban matrix, and that they often act as islands or habitat patches surrounded by impervious surfaces. And if we go to the next slide, where it says number 6, spatial theory, I'd like to introduce the concept that biofilters might be viewed as an interconnected network interacting with one another. We might want to view them this way to promote connectivity and the colonization of biota, plants or animals. We might want to introduce architectural, landscape, or functional heterogeneity. And we might want to have biofilters that in a spatial way have different systems specializing on different functions, but that act in some sort of integrated network. If we go to the next slide, island biogeography is one type of spatial ecological theory, a very old one. This predicts that the area or size of the biofilter might predict diversity, which we might want to maximize. It suggests that proximity to source populations is important, and that the spatial structure of habitats affects migration routes and stepping stones, in other words, the connectivity. If we click again here, we see landscape ecology pop up. This is sort of a modern version of island biogeography and spatial theory, and really focuses on fragmentation. And in fact, biofilters within an urban matrix are almost always fragmented habitats. We rarely think about them interacting with one another, but they may. If we go to the next slide, number C, community models, another type of spatial, or I should say meta-community models, is another type of spatial theory that is gaining some traction, and it looks at the interaction of whole assemblages. There's a whole set of theories which I don't have really time to discuss, but this is another ecological construct that might ultimately be of interest if we're trying to understand plants and animals in biofilters. If we go to number 7, the final ecological construct that I'd like to mention is ecosystem-based management. Here we're interested in managing biofilters potentially as an ecosystem with all the habitat components rather than for individual species or functions. We need to include humans as part of this ecosystem, and we may be interested in managing for multiple ecosystem services, not just water purification. And Jen Lei will be talking about this next. And my final slide, if you click again, I'd just like to close with the idea that we really haven't, well, there are all these theories out there that might be relevant to biofilter function. We just really haven't yet tested them, but there are many to test, and that we might consider using newly constructed biofilters to test some of these ideas about diversity, spatial structure, and so on. And with that, I'll close and thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. So do we have questions from anybody?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and it's going to, fortunately, it's going to set up a lot of things I'm going to talk about a little bit later.
I
I was
actually,
wondering.
Andrew, you go first.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was just going to say, I was interested in, the idea of, planting multiple different species with the hopes of selecting the best one. And I mean, that's a great, like you said, that is important when we don't know which one is going to perform the best. But do you also run the risk then, if you're planting multiple plant species, of taking up space that could be occupied by a highly performing plant with something that's a poorly performing plant? I mean, assuming that none of the plants die. I mean, would that be an argument, that sometimes planting too many different species might have actually negative effects in biofilters? I'm playing devil's advocate.
Sure. I mean, obviously, if you're out there to achieve a function and you know which plant does best, then that's the one you plant. But very often we're applying, for example, we might know what plant works best in Australia and Australian environmental conditions, but it might not be the plant that works best in Southern California or in some other country that somebody wants to apply this. So I think that we're ripe for experimentation. But the idea that you have a diversity of plants to achieve a diversity of functions is probably a useful one.
Thanks.
And I guess my question is about how to integrate sort of ecological theory models into sort of this idea that we have a human interrupted system. So if we have succession, there's going to be sort of the ecological clock and then the gardener's clock, or the human modification clock, which sort of goes into a disturbance kind of regime. But do you have any ideas on how to sort of integrate those sort of two aspects?
Well, if we recognize humans as part of the ecosystem and say the harvesting we might do or some other pruning, something we might do, and we acknowledge that that's disturbance, then I suppose you can integrate disturbance theory and try to better understand what that disturbance does to the whole system.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I could offer some kind of anecdotal stories about that, because we did a pretty big plant survey in a lot of the Australian biofilters, and we saw that the species richness went down with an older biofilters. The correlation coefficient wasn't very strong, but it was significant, and it was interesting to see that a lot of them were the few planting palettes I've seen, they do plant a lot of species, and then a lot of them tend to, what I think, be filtered out by the environment that they're in. And speaking to some of the managers, they actually will go in and replant with a different species and try something else out, because they notice that maybe this one POA grass doesn't do well, so they pick one that's in wetter habitats because the cell is wetter than they thought it would be. So they're adaptively managing these things.
That's really neat.
Too.
Yeah, so it's interesting because that's a strategy that we use in habitat restoration when it's unclear exactly what the physical conditions are going to end up with, or if we don't have very much knowledge about the right match between species and the habitat. And so you plant a larger palette than you expect in the end, and you sort of let them sort out themselves. They kind of know better what conditions they will do well under than you can guess, and so that you can use that actually, consciously as a strategy to get species that do well under those conditions.
I guess I have a question sort of extending from that. If somebody was then to try to classify what the age of the system is it the age from the first planting, the first construction, the age from the most recent replanting, or sort of redoing of the system? How does that work in a chronology?
Are you looking at the age with respect to contaminant removal? I think it depends on what the question is, right? Plant diversity or animal diversity, would affect what you did with the soils or the filter media. But it could be, you could have lots of ages depending on the question.
I have a question too, relating back to Anna's talk, and she talks a lot about trying to convince humans as part of the ecosystem to invest in biofilters and get on board with that idea through the planting of ornamentals. and moving away from some of the native species or some of the high-performing species in terms of things like pollutant removal, and essentially beautifying the biofilters so that people want them.
You should question for Jennifer.
Just curious to kind of get your reaction relative to the kind of framework that you laid out.
Yeah, I mean, most people think non-natives are bad, right? But if they improve acceptability, and they would have been there anyway, then it's probably a good thing. And I think Jennifer is going to talk about some of the other kinds of ecosystem services that might benefit from something like non-natives.
Thank you.
And I'll have a little bit to say about that too. So Lisa, I had one other question. It's a little bit related to what we were talking about in terms of letting the species sort out. It has to do with recruitment. So you don't talk about recruitment limitation in this talk anyway about your ecological theories, but certainly that could be an issue in these biofilters because some species might do well at self-seeding, you know, so replenishing themselves, but a lot of species may have a hard time getting there, even though they might do really well or they might perform these various functions. And so just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. You're thinking plant recruitment, right?
I was really thinking about plants, but it could be animals too. I mean, the animals, I mean, the plants we put in on purpose, and so that's a question of how does it evolve over time, or, you know, you might start with what would be a high-functioning set of species, but over time you might lose that because some don't recruit. Well, but animals, of course, we don't do anything with.
I mean, you know, there are some annuals that are really good at self-seeding, and you could put annuals like Solicornia bigelovii in if it was wet enough or something and get it to reproduce every year. Vegetative reproduction, you know, I don't know, is probably something that's quite important, but it could be that biofilter function isn't maximal with 100% plant cover. I honestly don't know the answer to that. You may not want a plant that's so good that it just outcompetes everything else and takes over all the space. But it, you know, in terms of recruitment, there's a whole set of other theories about what might promote recruitment, right? Could be shading, could be things that keep the soil moist, it could be whatever, temperature controls,
Yeah, and I guess that we don't know, of course, for most of these things, but thinking back to what Brandon said about what the managers are doing, they are manipulating the species composition, but it might not be the right, you know, the composition that would be the best, because they're doing the species that they think are going to do best. But again, like you said, it might be then you'll get 100% cover, and it's not necessarily the mix.
Right. I mean, you might get skimming flow over the, you know, you could have a really dense cover of a really dense grass, and the water would just be redirected over the biofilter and wouldn't even go in.
Right.
So, you know, you have to think about